Hello, YouTube viewers. That is to say, all 5 of you, and probably not even. Today, I'll be taking a bit of a departure from my usual format of live stream response videos to either conservatives or mostly theists. And instead, I'll be doing a scripted, pre-prepared response video to one Thomistic Disputations on Aquinas' first way, or the argument for motion. I have to give credit to Real Atheology for reaching out to me and bringing this video to my attention, as well as providing some of the resources I will be drawing from in order to make some of my responses to the video. So, the reason I'm doing this, or the reason I'm not doing a typical live stream response and instead opting for a scripted, more effort post, you can say, video response, is because this particular video by TD, Thomistic Disputations, purports to be responding to contemporary atheists working in analytic philosophy of religion, such as John Mackie, J.H. Sobel, Graham Oppy, and although not an atheist, Joe Schmid, and purports to be defending Aquinas' first way, or the argument for motion, from the criticisms of these philosophers. Therefore, I've decided that to undertake such a task as criticizing this video would require more effort. And so the purpose of this video is going to be to show that TD has far from saved the argument for motion from the criticisms of these philosophers, and that a lot of his points in response to these philosophers either misses the mark, that is to say, fails to be tracking what the philosophers are saying, or is otherwise dialectically inapt in a very serious way. And what I mean by this is there are a few cases where he sort of doesn't provide good motivations for accepting his view. At least he doesn't present reasons why you should accept his view over the relevant alternatives presented, over and above sort of just repeating exactly what it is at issue, which is dialectically worthless in that context, right? And or in sort of repeating his metaphysical commitments, which he gives no reason to accept, right? And this is a problem I have with a lot of Thomists in general, right? They just sort of assume or take their metaphysical commitments for granted. And we're going to be seeing that this is a pretty big issue for this particular video, and I'll be getting into the response now.
Oppy, Mackie, Sobel, and Schmid. These are the kind of philosophers that you will find most often cited by more philosophically informed atheists. So I wanted to see how they do against the argument for motion, or the first way of St. Thomas Aquinas. Let's start by looking at Graham Oppy's book, Arguing About Gods. For starters, the argument is plainly invalid. The most that could follow from the premise is that there are first causes of change that are not in the process of change. There's nothing in the premise of this argument that justifies drawing the conclusion that there is a unique first cause of change that is not itself in the process of change. So I would argue that Oppy here is misunderstanding St. Thomas's conclusion, or is relying on others who are misunderstanding it. I would argue that St. Thomas does not intend the first way to conclude that there is a unique first cause. This is why in question 11, article 3 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas questions whether God is one, and concludes that it is impossible, therefore, that many gods should exist. If St. Thomas were to take the first way to establish that there is a single unique first cause, then he would, as he often does in the Summa, state that it has already been proven previously that there is a single unique first cause. But he doesn't do that, which indicates to me that he doesn't believe that.
Okay, so TD is just misunderstanding Dr. Oppy's objection here. Oppy's objection is not that the argument doesn't establish that there is a single God. His objection is that the argument concludes that there is a unique first cause of all of change. In other words, a unique first cause of all chains of potentiality to actuality, right? Because that is the Thomistic account of change. When in fact, the previous premises in the argument are consistent with there being different causes for each chain of chains, or different sets of changes, or what Scott McDonald calls mundane movers for each, change or set of changes. So, for instance, those changes involving water, those changes involving transfers of heat, those changes involving the functions of organs and other biological systems, etc., those could each have a separate first cause, right? The argument doesn't get you to there being a cause of change, itself, qua change itself. So, and this is an issue because Aquinas' argument doesn't merely conclude that there are mundane movers, right? But rather, it concludes that there is a cause of motion that is itself unmovable, right? Unmovable in all respects, as opposed to the respect in which that is relevant to the specific chain of change, right? It could if, for example, a cause of transfer of heat couldn't be unmovable with respect to its state of heat, right? So, given this, the argument as it stands is just plainly invalid, right? And so, just to be clear, the problem Oppy underlies is that the argument is supposed to show that there is a first cause of all of change. His point is not merely that the argument doesn't establish that that this cause cannot be multiple entities or gods, right? So the upshot here is just this response by TD just plainly misses the mark and fails to track Dr. Oppy's objection.
He continues saying the second premise, that anything is in a process of change, is being changed by something else, seems highly controversial. There are objectively chancy processes, then there are processes of change that are not brought about by anything else. This is simply not true. All that St. Thomas's claim ultimately amounts to is that any reduction of potentiality to actuality is reduced by something actual. A potentiality could be reduced to actuality by something in actuality without being determined to being actualized in X or Y way. So, for example, let's say a person can will either to eat steak or to eat a salad. Suppose that person wills freely to eat a steak. It isn't necessary that the potentiality is not reduced to actuality by God. What's necessary is simply that God doesn't determine which actuality is actualized. Just because a cause actualizes a potential doesn't mean that it determines the fact that that potential is actualized rather than another. That's like an additional claim that isn't necessary. I should also note that Aristotle presents an argument for this premise in the Physics, Book 7. The argument is based on a earlier conclusion he proved that everything in motion is divisible. He basically notes that divisibles would not move if its parts were not moving. Hence, since everything in motion is divisible, everything in motion depends on its parts for its motion. Even if we suppose that a particle just pops into existence randomly and is moving without a prior cause, this will still be dependent on that particle's parts. And it would still be true that everything in motion is moved by another. There is not even a need to deny that a particle can pop into existence and move without a prior cause. All that's necessary is to note that this is made of parts, and therefore it depends on another.
I'm a bit confused by TD's response here, because I'm not going to lie, I'm having difficulty grasping how what TD says here even addresses Oppy's objection at all, right? So he uses the example of virtual particles bouncing around or popping into existence as a result of chancy causes. I'm not sure if this is accurate at all. I'm not knowledgeable on quantum physics at all. But yeah, he uses the example of virtual particles, pointing out that they still depend on the relevant sort of way on its parts, such as quarks or what have you. But the actual example Oppy uses, and you can check this out, like in the like directly after the part TD paraphrases in the original book, arguing against gods, and in fact I will put a link to that book in the description. But the actual example Oppy uses is libertarian free decisions, and obviously libertarian free decisions don't depend on parts in the way particles do, right? Obviously a libertarian free decision isn't made up of parts. Like, what the hell would that even mean? So neither ex hypothesi do they depend obviously on prior states, such as the agent's past psychological states or external antecedent conditions, etc., etc., etc. So could TD say then that it is the particular LFW? So LFW in this case means libertarian free will. So is it the particular LFW agent that the decisions depend on? No, because ex hypothesi, there are many possible worlds where the given agent exists, but the LFW action does not obtain, or the LFW decision, choice, whatever you want to say, does not obtain. So, I mean, surely then at this point we've ruled out all plausible candidates, right? Surely then LFW actions don't ontologically depend on anything, or at the very least, TD leaves it a complete mystery what the ontological dependence relation is even supposed to be.
Oppy also addresses the infinite regress, but his most significant criticism of St. Thomas's argument is dealt with in his criticism of the second way. Aquinas does offer an argument on behalf of the key infinite regress premise in the second way, recapitulating a similar argument that is given in the first way. What he says is that if there were no first cause in a series of causes, then there would be no intermediate causes either, and hence no effect. But this argument is powerless to establish the conclusion that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. For if there were an infinite regress of causes, then it would be true that there is no first cause, and yet it could also be true that if any of the earlier causes were eliminated, the effect would be eliminated as well. I think Oppy here simply doesn't understand the argument. Let's see how St. Thomas describes the argument. This process cannot be traced back into infinity, for everything that is moved by another is a sort of instrument of the first mover. Therefore, if a first is lacking, all things that move will be instruments. But if the series of movers and things moves is infinite, there can be no first mover. In such a case, these infinitely many movers and things moved will all be instruments. But even the unlearned perceive how ridiculous it is to suppose that instruments are moved, unless they are set in motion by some principal agent. This would be like fancying that when a chest or a bed is being built, the saw or hatchet performs its function without a carpenter. So the reason St. Thomas sees the infinite regress as impossible is because he's thinking about a series where each member moves as an instrument. And hence, of course, instruments cannot move without the first principle, which causes an instrument to move, just by definition. But why think that motion involves a sort of series? The reason is because it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. As St. Thomas explains in the Summa Theologiae, whatever is in motion cannot have its actuality it is moved towards in itself, but it must receive it from another. Hence, if you have an infinite regress of things in motion, or things without their actuality in themselves, this would lead to an impossible situation where you have these instrumental causes without a first. Or, in other words, actually driving this actuality from another when nothing has that actuality.
So, I don't really have much to say here. I think this is either a case of sloppiness or worse, misdirection on TD's part, unfortunately. He's responding to Oppy on the second way, which is constructed as an argument specifically about efficient causation, as if Oppy is talking about the first way, when in fact he isn't. So the quotation he provides of Dr. Oppy, from arguing about gods, is in regards to an infinite regress of efficient causes. It has nothing to do with per se chains. I mean, he literally explicitly states right there in the part that TD paraphrases that the argument is powerless to establish that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, and as in like efficient causes. So the quotations he brings up from Aquinas and everything are just completely irrelevant here. This is just an error on TD's end.
That said, Mackie does address the idea of an infinite regress being impossible, and he seems to understand the point. He says that if a creature's essence doesn't include existence, then deriving existence from an infinite regress will do no good. Nothing could end it but a being whose essence involves existence. But he asks, why, for example, might there not be a permanent stock of matter whose essence did not involve existence, but which did not derive its existence from anything else? This is the brute facts approach to the proofs for existence of God. Maybe things just exist without any cause.
So not quite. What Mackie is saying is that the regress could terminate in an object. In Mackie's case, the object would be a permanent block of matter, which does not derive its existence from anything else, but which nevertheless doesn't have an essence which includes existence. But this doesn't entail that there is no explanation for the object's existence at all. I mean, the explanation could be, for instance, that the object is metaphysically necessary. It obtains in all possible worlds. So the explanation for why it exists is just that it has to exist. It necessarily exists. But in any case, I would say that Mackie is granting too much here. I would just reject the entire idea of things existing in virtue of another or in themselves in the first place. I subscribe to a sort of Frege-Aquine view of existence, and this kind of view in meta-ontology that TD is gesturing at has always seemed like gibberish to me. Like, when Thomists go on about this sort of thing, they are talking about concepts I literally do not have. Like, I literally just completely lack the concept of an equivocity of being or a plurality of being. I do not know what Thomists are talking about. I just don't know what they're talking about. Like, I've never seen it explained in such a way that just doesn't come across as just gibberish to me. And I'm being completely serious right now. Like, this could be a conceptual deficiency on my part. I know there are some intelligent people who claim to know what they're talking about in regards to this sort of thing, but I doubt it, because I know I'm not the only one who has this sort of view.
But I'd argue this is nonsense. As Garrigou-Lagrange said, we are absolutely certain that every being which is indifferent to existence requires an efficient cause. That is to say, has to be realized whether in time or from eternity, makes no difference. Because the intellect knows intuitively that this being does not exist as something which has existence intrinsically and primarily as its own, per se prima, but as something which gets this existence from another. If a thing's essence does not include existence, then considered in itself it is indifferent to existence. It may or may not exist. So, when considering aliens, for example, because their essence and existence are distinct, you can understand their essence without understanding their existence. Hence, you need something else in addition to its essence to determine one way or another whether it exists, to distinguish it from nothing. Without this distinguishing factor, there would be no difference between something that exists and something that does not exist, which would violate the principle that being is not non-being, or the principle of non-contradiction. As Scott Sullivan said, to ask why a thing exists is the same as the question what distinguishes this thing from nothing. To lack a distinction from nothing is to be identical to nothing and thus not a being at all. Therefore, there must be something that makes beings distinct from nothing, a reason or fundamentum distinctionis. And that reason cannot be nothing, for then there would be no distinction. To hold two things as distinct with absolutely no difference between them is a nonsensical position. In short, if nothing distinguishes a being from nothing, then it is not distinguished from nothing. Unless you're willing to deny basic principles of being, I don't think denying the existence of a cause, of the existence of a being, intrinsically indeterminate with respect to existence, is logical or reasonable. If they are intrinsically determinate with respect to existence, then they need to be extrinsically determined to exist.
Alright, so this is where we get into where TD seems to be taking too much for granted of his own very controversial metaphysical commitments and meta-ontology. So why think things exist to the extent that their essence contains existence? Why think there's even a distinction between essence and existence in the first place? That hasn't been motivated. He gives the example of an alien, but I think for an alien to exist is just for all of its properties to be jointly satisfied in the actual world. Why think a further account than that is needed, right? I mean, this view does a fine job distinguishing the alien from nothing. The alien is distinguished from nothing in virtue of the properties it has, right? The concept of an alien, the mere concept, or some mental representation of an alien in my head, doesn't actually exemplify those properties. And similarly, we can say that what distinguishes Mackie's permanent block of matter from nothing is just in virtue of its exemplifying the set of properties it has, and there's nothing further to the story. So the question is, what's missing from this account? TD certainly doesn't explain what's missing from the account. And to go even further than this, I think there are a few good, at least prima facie reasons to just reject TD's view here. So following Frege, it seems existential statements are just numerical statements. So for example, a negative existential statement is just going to be the same as a numerical statement featuring a 0. So there are 0 instances answering to the concept of such and such would be a negative existential. For example, the concept pink elephant has 0 instances. And a positive existential then is going to be, well, just the negation of a numerical statement using 0. So for example, it's not the case that there are 0 instances of the concept brown dogs, or there is at least 1 instance of the concept lion. But then once we understand this, there's going to be an issue with the Thomist project here. For one, numerical statements are about concepts, not objects. So, like when we say we have 10 divisions, for example, we aren't talking about the objects we're referring to and picking out in that statement. Because the objects I'm referring to in that statement could be understood as well as 10,000 soldiers or 2,000 platoons. So what I'm saying then must be that there are 10 instances of the concept division. But On the Thomistic view, at least as a TD characterizes it, we must be making existential statements about objects. We have to say things like, objects derive their existence from others, and objects exist in themselves, right? Because we can't be saying that, like, concepts derive their existence from others, right? Concepts don't derive their existence from others or in themselves, because concepts don't necessarily exist at all. And that's just one point. But the second point is numerical statements are univocal, right? So when we say that there are 5 instances of the concept chihuahua, and there are 5 instances of the concept water bottle, 5 isn't being used in a different sense here. 5 is being predicated univocally of both chihuahuas and water bottles. And this would be like the same for all existentials. Like even when we talk about God, like when we say there's one instance of the concept of me, truth teller, and there's one instance of the concept God, there's one God, then we'd be predicating one univocally of both me and God, right? There's no sense in which numbers are used in different senses and not predicated univocally. But on TD's view, the problem is existence isn't univocal. There's a distinction between things that exist from another, which would be ordinary objects such as tables, chairs, humans, etc., and things which have existence in themselves, such as God, right? But there is no room for this equivocal account of being on the view I've laid out, where existential statements are just numerical statements. And then yet another reason to reject TD's view here is we can imagine a species of like Martians with their own unique Martian language who do not have terms such as essence, being, existence, but nonetheless lose no expressive power when talking about existentials. They can convey the same exact semantical content by saying things like, there exists an X, there is no X. Like obviously I'm removing the word existence from their language, but there is an X, there are no Ys, it's not the case that there are no Ys, right? And they can convey the same exact content with respect to existential statements. And so this particular point that I'm laying out here is one I got from Peter Van Inwagen's Being, Essence, and Ontological Commitment, which I will link in the description.
So now let's turn to Sobel, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, so I apologize if I'm not. But let's turn to his book, Logic and Theism. The first way is vulnerable to the apparent possibility of self-moving things that have always been in motion. For St. Thomas Aquinas' premise that whatever is moved by another is presumably meant to be a statement of strict metaphysical necessity. But it seems that at least things in perpetual motion could be self-movers. It seems in Aquinas' Aristotelian terms that they could be at every moment things is actually in motion and potentially in motion in the immediate future. Their changing potentialities could be continuously actualized by the action of their immediately antecedent actualities. This conception of a self-moving perpetual mover does not involve its being in the same respect and same way, both mover and moved. The issue is that what St. Thomas's argument shows is that beings which can change are in themselves indifferent to the actuality. In order for the water to be changed from hot to cold, say, the water has to be considered in itself indifferent to hot or cold. Hence, it cannot be in virtue of the water itself that it is hot or cold. Otherwise, it would necessarily be hot or cold. You need some additional feature to determine it to heat or cold. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, everything which is able to be and not be has a cause. For considered in itself, it is indifferent to either, so that something else must exist which determines it to one.
So TD's response here is once again dialectically toothless and almost verges on begging the question. I have yet to read Logic and Theism, admittedly, though I plan to in the near future. But Sobel's point, as presented in the quote that TD provides, is that actualizes of potentials can be explained by the action of a given relevant object's immediately antecedent actualities. Sorry. So, what does this mean? Well, to use TD's own example, say there's a state of water being 25 degrees centigrade, so room temperature roughly, at T1, and T1 is just a signifier of time or a point of time, to boiling at 100 degrees centigrade at T2. In this case, what explains its heat at T2 would be its immediately prior antecedent states of heat prior to T2 and posterior to T1, including its currently rigid temperature relative to T1 and its dispositional tendency for its temperature to continue to rise, and the absence of factors preventing the water from arriving at 100 degrees centigrade at T2. Now, what is TD's response to this possibility? How does he rule it out? Well, I mean, unfortunately, it just seems his response is merely to pound the table and to assert that the water itself has to be indifferent to hot or cold, and that you need some external factor to transform it from a state of room temperature to boiling. But, I mean, isn't that not just the very claim that's in dispute? Why think that the water's immediately antecedent conditions could not be what explains the water's going from 25 degrees centigrade to 100 degrees centigrade, such as, again, a dispositional tendency present inside the water, like in the water itself, for its temperature to rise? Like, why does there have to be something external? Now, granted, in mundane cases, with the water's boiling heat, it would be explained by the heating of the stove, transferring heat into the pot and through to the water. But surely it's at least possible for water to heat itself. Surely it could at least be that there's a set of self-moving things that are analogous to the self-heating water case that we've been pursuing here. TD doesn't explain why this is an impossibility aside from just repeating his account and paraphrasing Aquinas repeating his account. But that's not what we're interested in. I mean, it's nice that you can quote Aquinas claiming something, but why should I believe Aquinas' claim there? What's the justification? Merely repeating the claim in light of Sobel's objection is not apt. Now, TD proceeds to make the same error he made with Oppy to Sobel in regards to the infinite regress thing, confusing a response to the second way with a response to the first way, and the possibility of there being more than one first movers. Now, I feel no need to correct these errors a second time, so instead, let's just continue with the section on Joe Schmid.
Here's what he says. It doesn't follow that there would be an entire concrete object, i.e. being, that is prior to the first being. Instead, the actuality or actualities of a single being, B, could be prior to the potentiality or potencies of B. Hence, act would be prior to potency, but there would be nothing prior to B. Hence, in principle, B could be a first being, while nevertheless having potency. I think this is actually a misunderstanding of what St. Thomas Aquinas is claiming. I don't think St. Thomas is claiming here that necessarily the pure actuality, which is prior to all potentialities, is necessarily not a part of a whole being. Because he asks in Article 8 this question, whether God enters into the composition of other things, and provides an argument against that possibility. Furthermore, if you go back to Aristotle's original argument for motion, what he argues there is that we know that everything is moved by another, because even if we have a whole that moves itself, this whole is going to be composed of parts based on early arguments inside of physics, and this whole is going to depend on those parts for its existence, and so therefore the whole depends on another. And that's literally his conclusion, and of course St. Thomas agrees with that conclusion.
So the way Joe makes his point here is a little bit confusing, but it's basically that for all the argument from motion concludes, it doesn't have to be an entire concrete being of pure act that is the first cause. Rather, we can have a first being that contains the first actuality or actualities, but said being also has a set of potentialities which depend on its prior actuality or actualities. So the so-called unactualized actualizers that the argument from motion gets us to would be actuality or actualities contained in a single being, but said being can also have unactualized potencies, and thus it wouldn't be a being of pure act. Now, TD responds to this by pointing out that Aquinas isn't trying to show, at least not currently, that the first cause is a purely actual being, rather than the pure actuality contained in the first being, which also has potencies. Now, I'm skeptical of this, but let's just take him at his word for the sake of argument. So how then do we arrive at a purely actual actualizer then? Because surely that's the desired conclusion we want to get to here. TD sorta alludes to this by implying that the being in question would have parts, the being that, like the first being that Joe alludes to, since it has potentialities in addition to actualities, and so thus the being would still depend on its parts. But, I mean, surely this is mistaken. On what Joe laid out, the given being's potentialities all depend on the being's prior actuality, or actualities. Ugh. And since ex hypothesi, this is the first being, its prior actuality or actualities would be prior to every potentiality. So, the first being's prior actuality, then, again ex hypothesi, would not, and indeed could not, depend on parts. So TD also claims that Article 8 on God's simplicity in the Summa Theologia proves that God, in this case understood as the actuality that is prior to all potentialities, cannot be part of a compound, and thus cannot just be a set of actualities contained in a single being.
You can use Article 8 to prove that the first being is not a part of a whole, so this isn't really a problem in the grand scheme of things, even if you hold that St. Thomas made a mistake here.
So I checked out Article 8, whether God enters into composition of other things. I'll also add a link in the description for those interested, my 3 viewers interested in reading along. So Aquinas gives 3 reasons to think God cannot enter into composition with other things. Needless to say, I think the reasons Aquinas gives are not very compelling, at least as reasons to think that the first actuality cannot be part of a single being. He says, quote, "First, God is the first efficient cause. Now, the efficient cause is not identical numerically with the form of the thing caused, but only specifically, for man begets man. But primary matter can be neither numerically nor specifically identical with an efficient cause, for the former is merely potential while the latter is actual." End quote. So first off, Aquinas' argument here seems to be parasitic upon him already having established that there is a first efficient cause via the second way. I would not grant him that much, and I think there are plausible refutations of the second way, but we can leave that aside. Moreover, Aquinas is right to say that prime matter, that is to say, pure passive potency, cannot be identical to an efficient cause. But this doesn't mean that the first mover must be a being of pure act, as opposed to an actuality or a set of actualities contained in a first being that also happens to have potencies. After all, it's not like on this view that I just outlined, those actualities would be identical in any respect to prime matter. So Aquinas goes on to say, quote, "Secondly, since God is the first efficient cause, to act belongs to him primarily and essentially, but that which enters into composition with anything does not act primarily and essentially, but rather the composite so acts. For the hand does not act, but the man by his hand, and fire warms by its heat. Hence God cannot be part of a compound." End quote. This response has the issue of being parasitic upon the second way, as does the previous response. But further, I don't see a reason in particular to grant that the act belongs to the first efficient cause essentially and primarily in the sense required. But, I mean, even so, we can say that the act itself belongs primarily and essentially to the prior actualities of the first being. The whole being itself would not be that which acts essentially and primarily, but the prior actualities of the being. I see no obvious issue that follows from this, at least at first blush. But Aquinas follows up. Quote, "Thirdly, because no part of a compound can be absolutely primal among beings, not even matter nor form, though they are the primal parts of every compound. For matter is merely potential, and potentiality is absolutely posterior to actuality, as it is clear from the foregoing. While a form which is part of a compound is a participative form, and as that which participates is posterior to that which is essential, so likewise is that which is participated. As fire in ignited objects is posterior to fire that is essentially such. Now it has been proved that God is absolutely primal being." This isn't a problem for Joe's objection. Joe is granting that potentiality is absolutely posterior to actuality. As Joe says on the quote that TD provides in the video, act would still be prior to potency, but nothing would be prior to B, B being the stipulated first being. So the actualities, or the actuality or actualities in question would not be a primal being, right? But that's only because they wouldn't be an entire concrete being in the first place. And it seems to me that that's just the entire point of Joe's objection. Alright, it's been brought to my attention that in the process of me editing this video that Joe actually preempts in response to TD/Aquinas' criticism in a chapter in a forthcoming book he will be publishing. He says, and I quote, "One might again object at this juncture that Aquinas in Summa Theologiae, the claim that the foundational, purely actual reality that actualizes all else, what Aquinas terms God in the quoted passages that follow, cannot enter into composition with other things, and yet, if the foundational, purely actual reality were simply a proper part of B, such a reality would enter into composition with other things." But once again, this objection is not convincing. First, our suggestion in this section is not that the purely actual reality enters into composition as a formal or material principle or something. Instead, the suggestion is that the actualities of B, which, qua aspects of B, are not quite purely actual realities in their own right, are prior to B's potentialities. Furthermore, the suggestion is not that such actualities are formal or material principles of B. Their status need not be that of B's formal material cause. Indeed, the actualities of B need not even be causes, whether efficient, formal, final, or material. B's actualities need not only be actualities upon which the potencies of B explanatorily depend. So, once again, what Aquinas addresses in Summa Theologiae simply fails to engage our criticism. So there you go. I'm not going to put this in the description just yet, because I don't know if I actually have permission to do that, but there you go.
Second, as we've seen, the first way only gets us to the claim that there is at least one first member, T, of chain C, that is actually unmoved at time T in respect to the causal power or property of C. Assuming, of course, the truth of the first way's causal principle and the requirement that per se chains be finite, it therefore does not establish the existence of a first being, that is, the most fundamental being, more fundamental than all else and in every respect. Instead, it only shows at most that each chain has a first member T of that chain, which has nothing prior to it in respect to the causal power of C, only during times at which T stands as first member of C. But this is perfectly compatible with T standing at potency in some other respects, e.g. in some respect that has nothing to do with causal power or property of the C, for which it serves as terminus. Hence, it is perfectly compatible with there being something more fundamental than T in that particular respect, but yet not with respect to the causal power / property of C. Okay, let's try to formulate St. Thomas Aquinas' argument before responding. 1. Actuality is prior to potentiality. 2. Nothing is prior to God. 3. If God were at all potential, actuality would have to be prior to God, at least partially. Therefore, God cannot be at all potential. Now, it is important to ensure we do not confuse premise 1 with a premise more directly derived from the causal principle in the first way, which is something like actuality is prior to a potential which has been actualized. Given this premise, we need something actual prior to a potential which has been actualized, but we don't necessarily need actuality prior to potentiality which is unactualized. Hence, you can have a being or beings which are composed of potentiality and actuality without anything being prior to them. St. Thomas's claim is much broader. It isn't only that those things which are actualized have to be actualized by another. He says actuality is prior to potentiality without qualification. Thus, by this principle, even unactualized potentials would have to be preceded ontologically by actuality proportionate to the potential. But why would anyone believe this broader premise? He gives a reason. For whatever is in potentiality can be reduced into actuality only by some being in actuality. It might not be immediately clear how St. Thomas's premise follows from this causal premise, but the way I interpret this is that potentiality could not exist if there were no actuality to actualize it. Hence, the existence of potentiality depends on actuality. Hence, there is a sort of sustaining relation between unactualized potentials and actuality. The moment the actuality proportionate to the unactualized potentiality goes out of existence, so does the unactualized potentiality. Hence, actuality is prior to potentiality, absolutely.
So TD fails to track Joe's objection here. And his response is just a total non-response. Now, I don't want to be needlessly mean to TD here, but I was definitely internally screaming at him during my first viewing of this part for basically missing the same point for a third time, despite how clearly Joe spells it out this time in the quote. So, first, I think it's necessary for us to sort of clarify what Joe's point is. So the idea is that the first way falls short of establishing that there is a unique cause of being that all chains of motion depend on. Rather, what we get is that each per se chain could have a separate terminus, itself unactualized, qua the particular property or causal power relevant to the chain in question. But it could still have potency qua some other property or set of properties or causal powers it has. For example, let's say the property under consideration is redness. The chain would terminate in something that does not derive its redness from anything else, so it is unactualized or unmovable qua redness, but in other respects it could derive, say, its shape, if it had one, its spatial location, again, if it had one, or perhaps its permanence throughout space and time, for another. So it would not be fundamental, changeless, and ontologically independent in every respect. It would just be with respect to redness. And this is just straightforwardly correct. And to suppose otherwise would just be to commit a quantifier shift fallacy. So just as it doesn't follow from the fact that each man has a mother, that there is a mother of all men, it similarly doesn't follow from the fact that from each per se chain has a cause, that there is a first cause of all per se chains. So what is TD's response to this undercutting defeater? Well, he points out that Aquinas' view is not just that things which are actualized by another, but actuality without qualification is prior to potentiality. Okay, but like, why are you saying this, man? Like, literally no one disputes this. I have no idea how you could even think that Joe is confused by this point. And most importantly, this just doesn't engage with the objection. You can have a terminus, which has its actuality prior to potentiality qua redness, or qua some particular respect, whatever respect you want to say, under consideration, and we can have a set of chains which terminate in exemplifying such and such particular property or disposition in itself, but this doesn't get you to the claim that there is something that exemplifies actuality qua actuality that derives its actuality in all respects in itself and is prior to all potentialities. Right? You don't get that claim. And that is exactly what hasn't been motivated. Like, we can just literally grant everything TD says here in his response, but he still hasn't actually dealt with the problem.
Actuality is prior to potentiality, absolutely. Joe challenges premise 2 of this argument, saying there is a first unmoved, but that doesn't mean it is unmovable. Thus, there could be something ontologically prior to the first unmoved of a given causal chain. I think we have to consider that the essential conclusion of the first way isn't that there is a being which is currently not moving. If that were the conclusion, then, that unmoving being could just be a fully actualized being which had just finished its movement. I don't think that's what St. Thomas was trying to get at. As I explained earlier, the key here is the fact that the actuality is derived from another, since it is indifferent to that actuality in itself. That's why St. Thomas explains motion in terms of actuality and potentiality in the first place. All that St. Thomas's first way is essentially saying is, hey, these things do not have what they have in a self-contained way. They derive it from another. We know this because they have the ability to change, and things that have the ability to change are in potentiality with respect to that actuality. They don't have that actuality in themselves. So when we look at Joe's claim that all the first way gets you to is an unmoved being that could have been moved either in some other way or at another time, what you should ask yourself is this: does this unmoved being have all of its actuality in itself, or is it derived from another? If the being is movable, then the answer is going to be no, even if the being is not moving now.
I think the answer should be obvious, considering it's right there in front of you. It doesn't have all of its actuality in itself, but it has the actuality in itself with respect to the particular property or causal power of the given chain in question. Once again, TD misses Joe's point here. Joe's point is not that the terminus of the chain could be unmoving or unmoved. We can grant that the terminus has to be unmovable, but the issue is why think there is a single terminus unmovable in all respects rather than a collection each unmovable in a particular respect but movable in other respects. TD gives no reason whatsoever to rule this out as a possibility. Alright, well, that about wraps up my response here. There are a few other points that we could have gotten into, such as whether we have good reasons to accept an potency metaphysics in the first place. And I would contend that we do not, as I find eternalism is the most plausible metaphysics of time, and eternalism entails that change in the sense of actualization of potential doesn't actually exist, since there would be no unactualized potentials. Much of my criticism of the arguments is just that I think that Thomistic metaphysics is just unmotivated as a whole. But let's be honest, this response was getting bloated enough. Right, well, that's the end of this video. See you in the next one. Goodbye, YouTube.